Who can be compared with you in majesty? Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high, its top above the thick foliage. Waters nourished it, deep springs made it grow tall. Their streams flowed and all around its base and sent their channels in all the trees of the field. So it towered higher and higher, and all the trees of the field, and its boughs increased, and its branches grew along the spreading because of the abundant waters. All the birds of the air nested in its branches, and all the beasts of the field gave birth under its branches, and the great nations lived in its shade. It was majestic in beauty, with spreading boughs and roots that went down, and abundant waters. The cedars of the garden of God could not rival it, nor could the pine trees equal its boughs, nor could the plane trees compare with its branches. No tree in the garden of God could match its beauty. I made it beautiful, with abundant branches, and envy of all the trees of Eden in the garden of God. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because it towered on high, lifting up its top in its thick foliage, because it was proud of its height, I handed over to the ruler of the nations for him to deal with, according to his wickedness. I cast it aside. The most ruthless of foreign nations cut it down and left it. Its boughs fell, mountains and all the valleys, its branches lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. All the birds of the air settled on a fallen tree. All the beasts of the field were among its branches. Therefore, no other tree by the waters are ever to tower proudly on high, lifting up their tops above the thick foliage. No tree so well watered as ever to reach such a height. They are all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortal men, with those who go down to the pit. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day it brought down to the grave, I covered the deep springs with mourning for it. I laid black its streams, its abundant waters were restrained. Because of it, I clothed Lebanon with gloom, and all the trees of the field withered away. I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall when I brought it down to the grave, those who go down to the pit. Then all the trees of Eden, all the choicest best of Lebanon, all the trees that were well watered, were consoled in the earth below. Those who lived in its shade, its allies among the nations, all go down to the grave with it, joining those killed by the sword. With the trees of Eden, it can be compared with you in splendor and majesty. Yet you too will be brought down. With the trees of Eden, the earth below, you will lie among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. This Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares the sovereign Lord. Now, let me give you the overall idea before we look at the outline. Look at Lebanon. Compare it and what it was, what that nation was, what Assyria was. It was known, what Lebanon was known for its big cedar trees. So just as Tyre was known for its ships and sailing, and so he compares it to a ship and then says, I'm going to sink it. He compares that to Lebanon and Assyria to this big tree, because that's what they were known for, and said somebody came and cut it down, and it fell. And then he says to Pharaoh, just like they fell, you're going to fall. And then he says something very interesting in here, that never again is any nation going to do that. And then he says, what? That's the fate of all nations that try to tower above the other nations. When you set yourself up to be policemen of the world, that you want to grow up above the foliage and you want to be the nation that's over other nations. And you would try to make yourself not into a nation, but an empire that rules other nations. When you do that, you're setting yourself up to fall. And people have tried. Great Britain tried. Germany tried. France tried. The Romans tried. People try to set themselves up. And when they do, they're setting themselves up for a fall. If you read the intentions of our founders, you read them. They're like, we don't ever want to be that. We don't ever want to be that kind of empire that tries to rule the world. We want to just take care of our nation, be free here, trade with other nations, but not control them. You can read it in the writings of Washington. You can read it in the writings of Jefferson. You can read it in the writings of Madison. They had no intention to become a world empire. And if you do, you're setting yourself up for failure. When you become proud and think, our country is a little bit better than everybody else, we better enforce our will on them, God will cut the tree down. And that's what Egypt was trying to do. And so God cut it down. Okay, so here's the prophecy. Egypt is like to Syria. And who is Pharaoh like, he asks. Well, then he gives a description of the glory of Assyria and how it was a shelter to other people. And it was envied by all. It was this big, tall, better than everybody else. And got proud, so he cut it down. It talks about her sin of pride, her judgment, the description of her mourning. And then he says, who's Egypt like? Egypt's like Assyria. And you act like this is going to be your fate. So this is a prediction about Egypt, but a warning to all nations. Okay? What he's setting up here is, I don't care whether it's Assyria or Aram or Edom or Moab or Philistia or Judah or Tyre or Sidon or Egypt. It's all the same story. You exalt yourself above the other nations. You exalt yourself above God. You exalt yourself in pride and you turn to sin and you will not submit yourself to God. He comes and he tears you down. And the lessons we're learning here are specifically directed at literal nations and about literal events that happened before Judah was restored. But it's also lessons for all of us to this day that not only reverberate true for those people at that time, but as we study history and we look through history, we can see this is a consistent pattern that repeats itself throughout history. And it's exactly what our Constitution was designed to try to stop and hinder. That was what was so unique about our Constitution. It wasn't a king. There wasn't an elite group of people ruling. It was supposed to be governed by this Constitution that restrained the power of government so that it couldn't get too big for its britches. And if we lose that wisdom, we're going to fall into the same mistake that they fell into. And I'm getting off on my politics a little bit too much, sorry. But I see it coming. One of the things that is the book of Ezekiel, teaching the book of Ezekiel this semester, that bothers me is I see the reasons God destroyed nations and we're there. And it bothers me because I hurt for what we're going to go through, what my children, my grandchildren are going to go through. And what we're going to endure unless we repent. So this parable was on June 21st, 587 BC. Now, why am I pointing this out? Notice this is back before the fall of Jerusalem. The prophecies are not put in Ezekiel in the chronological order in which they're given. The prophecies in the book of Ezekiel are put into order based on nation and topic, not chronology. So what can we learn from that? That a book of prophecy, apocalyptic literature, is not always necessarily in chronological order. Ezekiel's very detailed in giving the day and of the month and the year and everything about when a prophecy happens. And from that we can see he orders them topically and based on, he puts all his Egyptian prophecies kind of together, but some of them were from before. And so the prophecies are not in chronological order. And we also see the same thing in Daniel, where things prophesied in Daniel years apart, one at the beginning of the book, another at the end of the book, are actually about the same event. Two different prophecies about the same events, separated by, a couple decades. And so when we look at apocalyptic literature, whether it's Daniel or Ezekiel or the book of Revelation, you can't go into Revelation and go, well, this is a chronological order of what happened in history. You can't start in chapter 4 and go to chapter 21, Judgment Day, and go, well, yeah, this is how all these things are going to happen in chronological order. No. Because he's not put the apocalyptic literature and prophecies like this, these separate prophecies, are not given in chronological order. Now, if it gives a chronology to it, it says this will happen, and then after that, this will happen. Well, then it'll happen after, but the after can be hundreds of years later. You got to be real careful trying to put a timeline to things. And so when you read the writings of these false teachers, these premillennial crackpots that are making predictions, they'll try to have a chronological reading of the book of Revelation, and that is bad hermeneutics. Even some of the Gospels are not in chronological order. Now, Luke and John are in chronological order, and they say they are. But Matthew and Mark, they're not in chronological order. They're topically given, where they'll put a bunch of sermons and like parables together that are not necessarily in chronological order. How do we know? Because we have books like Luke that is in chronological order, and they're not the same order. And so you got to understand that it was not always the case, especially for Jewish people in the Eastern mind, to put their histories in chronological order. They would order them more by topic. Even the books of the Old Testament are not in chronological order. They're separated by types of literature. For example, the first 5 books are written by Moses. They're books of the law. And then you've got books of history, and it'll give the history books. And then after the history, you'll have the, what comes next, the poetry. And then after that, you'll have the major prophets, and you'll have the minor prophets. And it's separated by those types of literature, and they're in chronological order based on the type of literature, but some of those things are intermittent. And in fact, I had a hard time getting the chronology right after Solomon, because it became so confusing to me until I got this Bible where you read through in a year and it puts it in chronological order. And then it puts together the prophets and the events of history together and shows you what kings Isaiah was with, what kings Elijah and Elisha were with, what prophets they were with, or at the same time. And it gives you a better sense of the chronology, because they didn't put it in chronological order. New Testament puts the Gospels, and then it puts the book of Acts, but there's all kinds of stuff from the epistles that happened during the time of the book of Acts. And so it's not necessarily. And then even the epistles are not in chronological order, because they're separated by author. First by Paul, and then by Peter, and then by John. And then Jude, and James, and then Jude. And so it's divided up by who wrote it, not necessarily when it was written. And so the Bible isn't, you got to study it and understand it's not always placed, the books aren't always placed in chronological order, and the prophecies in this book of Ezekiel are not in chronological order. They're placed in order based on who he's prophesying against. So he puts all this Egyptian stuff together, see? And that's what you got to understand. The term Assyria can mean I will liken you. The word for I will liken you and the word for Assyria can be very similar. And so it could be he's not even necessarily talking about Assyria, he's more talking about the area of Lebanon, which is the way that just translated it. In light of this, he compares Assyria, or this nation in the Lebanon area with the trees, he compares it to a tree that's spread out, and its branches are shade for the birds and animals or other nations. So it's this nation, and it compares a nation to a tree, and then it says it kind of rose itself above the foliage, above the other trees, and tried to be the tree of trees. And so because of its pride and its arrogance, God sent somebody, specifically the Babylonians, and they cut it down. Cut the tree down. The great tree fell and was ruined because of its pride. It was expelled by God from Eden by the most terrible nation, Babylon. Only the birds and the beasts survived her fall. Like those who lamented Tyre's fall, so the many waters were stopped. Lebanon mourns, and there's a drought in Egypt. He contrasts the falling of the tree to the man going down to the grave, and it uses the word Sheol there. And Sheol can be translated as pit. It can be translated, some people translate it as grave. Some people translate it as Hades. Some people translate it as death. But it has the idea, it means going down to the grave, going down, they die. Egypt then is going to be likened to a great standing tree. that is one that's fallen. She's rotting like a man who has no burial. So just like as a tree falls over and rots in the woods, Egypt's going to fall over and rot and not be buried. And that's what happened to Egypt. Now, it's not a crazy thing to predict the fall of a nation or an empire. Egypt had already fallen twice, and they were now on their third dynasty. So it had happened before where Egypt fell and one dynasty of kings was replaced by another. That was nothing new in history. But the interesting thing that Ezekiel prophesies is that Egypt's going to go down and never come back. Never be a nation that rules over other nations again. It's never going to stick its head up and be the dominant force that it had been for centuries. And that's true. Egypt never again was a world power. There's no longer any Egyptian dominance. I mean, before this, the two big powers in the world were Babylon and Egypt. And they were competing. They're kind of in a Cold War. And they had these other wars that they were fighting. But finally, Babylon's going to come and wipe out Egypt and remove them forever as a world power. And so that's what's going to happen. God would cause mourning for Egypt, so he covered the deep with sackcloth. That's when you were mourning, one of the things you would wear, you put on sackcloth and wear sackcloth. So he says he's going to cover the deep with sackcloth. Not literal. There was not a giant thing of sackcloth that covered the ocean. He's talking metaphorically. He would, for she would lament for her fall and to her pride. And what is true of the fall of Assyria would also be true of the fall of Egypt. It's not wrong to be great if God made you great. It's wrong to exalt yourself and take the credit. It's not wrong to be a great nation. What's wrong is when you try to dominate others around you and become prideful. When it goes from patriotism to nationalism, there's sin. It's one thing to say I'm American and I'm proud to be an American and I love my country. It's another thing to say, Canada and Mexico, you better do what we want. In fact, let's just take over Canada and Mexico. That would be bad. And that's what they did. And that's why Egypt is no more. And don't envy the mighty, or you'll fall as they did. And whenever a nation tries to set itself up and dominate others, God will intervene. He did it with the Soviet Union. I don't know why Vladimir Putin didn't learn the first time. Now he's got 100,000 soldiers linked up against Ukraine right now. Maybe he'll invade Ukraine. I don't know. I know it's not going to bode well for them if they try to do that to their neighbors. It just won't. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Remember that before you pick an idol. If we admire somebody or something too much. And in verse 10, it shows us the sin of bragging. When my dad was a kid, he was bragging to my grandpa about what a good basketball player he was. He says, well, you're being kind of braggadocious. And Dad says, well, if you don't toot your own horn, nobody else will. And Grandpa said, well, that's true, but you'll always be playing a solo. And Jesus said, it's better for somebody else to reward you than reward yourself and compliment yourself. Don't put yourself and exalt yourself. Humble yourself and you'll be exalted. And you get braggadocious, that's when things go bad. The latest example I can think of in the world is Donald Trump. You brag, take all the credit. You won't stick around. I don't care if you did some good. You don't take credit. You don't make it about you. You just don't. When a large tree falls, the little trees nearby are damaged. And that big tree is going to fall, and it's going to hurt other people around. When you imagine that you're great, you'll find that it's just your imagination. You're not as good as your friends say you are. You're not as bad as your enemies say you are. If Egypt needed precedent for her judgment, Assyria is the precedent. If you want an example, well, history's littered with them. From Nimrod on, Assyrian kings were bold and proud, but were all gone. They disappear. You can spread out, grow tall, protect others, give rest and shelter to lesser persons, but still be chopped down. Just because you think you're something doesn't mean that God can't bring you down. And when you exalt yourself, you'll be humbled. That's a life principle, true in every realm. Physical, spiritual, financial, emotional, relational. I don't care where you apply that. If you exalt yourself, you'll be humbled. Again, compare the fall of Babylon with the fall of Assyria and Egypt. They all gave into pride. I mean, what did Nebuchadnezzar? Is he was proud, and God removed him from power for 7 years. But then Nebuchadnezzar, unique kind of, is he repented, and so what did God do? God put Nebuchadnezzar back in as the leader because he humbled himself. And somebody ought to tell that one to drop. Revelation 18:9, and the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and live deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament her, for they shall see the smoke of her burning. And so the same concept of what God predicted for Babylon, for Judah, for Egypt, for Tyre, he makes that same kind of prediction about the Roman Empire in the book of Revelation. And so in Revelation, when it talks about the beast, the Roman Empire is what that is in the book of Revelation. And then he makes this prediction. It's the same principle. So we see the same principle played out after Christianity as well. And so in the apocalyptic literature, he's not just borrowing some terms. He's heavily leaning on the concepts from the book of Ezekiel that are played out in the book of Revelation. And by understanding what it means in the book of Ezekiel, we can understand what it means in the book of Revelation, what he's saying about the Roman Empire. All nations that forget God are turned to hell. Verse 17. It's that word grave, that word Sheol, is sometimes translated hell. And where do bad nations go? Down to the grave. I mean, think of every ancient nation that we can study. Where'd it go? Down to the grave. Fell over like a tree and then lay there and rotted. And all around the world, we can find the remains of the rotting corpses, the decayed bones and structures of fallen empires. Everywhere is the picked over bones and remnants of the Roman Empire. You know, they just fall and rot. And the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and the more it affects the world. And we've seen it in the past century, in your own lifetimes. Many of you lived in fear and terror of the Soviet Union. You grew up ducking and covering and bomb shelters, and the Cuban Missile Crisis terrified you in your youth. And I grew up in mortal fear that the Russians were going to attack. You know, I was 14 years old and wanted to join the military and was ready to fight the communists. You know, I'd seen Red Dawn, right? Wolverines. You know, I was ready to, you know, sure. And by the time, before I even graduated high school, it was gone. It was just gone. You know? One day we're living in mortal fear of this guy with a spot on his head, and the next, it's over. And God will send these people. Someone needs to tell China they're on the wrong path, because God will bring them low. And really, really, really come to understand this. And for me, this is the part of Ezekiel I draw comfort from. Is that God won't let wicked, tyrannical people dominate the world. And every time somebody tries, he puts the brakes on. And I know as technology increases, it gets scarier, and they can do some damage. And it when the tree falls, it can crush a lot of stuff and mess the forest up. But God's not going to let some wicked nation take over the world. That just won't happen. Some people think that there's a conspiracy among evil people, the Illuminati they call it, to take over the world. If there is, they won't succeed. We don't have to live in fear of that kind of stuff. God is with us and God is watching over us. Now, can wicked people cause a lot of damage? Could something bad happen to our country if we don't repent? Yeah. Can we go through some hard times? Sure. But God's always going to leave his remnant. And our hope isn't in this trash pit anyway. Our hope's in eternal life in heaven and in Jesus Christ. And even if we were all killed tonight, some whack job came in with a gun and shot us up, we're going to heaven. And that's all that's promised. And that's where our hope is. Because we're a part of a nation that can't be destroyed. We're a part of a kingdom that can't be shaken. That's invincible. And that's what we're part of when we come to Christ. So, chapter 32. Let's read it together. A lament for Pharaoh. In the 12th year, in the 12th month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, take up a lament concerning Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you're a lion among the nations. You're like a monster in the seas, thrashing about in the streams, churning the water with your feet, muddying streams. And he uses the word there for Leviathan. It's like a dragon. Leviathan was the Bible word for a dragon-like creature. A giant dinosaur of the sea. You can read about him in the book of Job. This is what the sovereign Lord says. With a great throng of people, I will cast my net over you. So you're a sea monster. Okay? Terrible. Fearful. Oh, a sea monster, Not the friendly Loch Ness monster kind. No, the terrible dragon, fire-breathing kind. But I'm going to cast my net over you. And I will haul you up in my net, and I will throw you on land, and I will hurl you open in a field, and I will let all the birds of the air settle on you, and all the beasts of the earth gorge themselves on you. I will spread your flesh on the mountains. I will fill the valleys with your remains. I will drench the land with your flowing blood all the way to the mountains, and the ravines will be filled with your flesh. When I snuff you out, I'll cover the heavens and the darkness of the stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights of the heavens will darken over you, and I will bring darkness over the land, declares the sovereign Lord. I will trouble the hearts of many people. I will bring about your destruction with the nations among the lands you have not known. I will cause many people to be appalled at you, and their kings will shudder with horror because of you. When I brandish my sword before them on the day of your downfall, each of them will tremble every moment for his life. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, the sword of the king of Babylon will come against you, and I will cause your hordes to fall by the sword of the mighty men, the most ruthless of all nations. They will shatter the pride of Egypt, and all her hordes will be overthrown. I will destroy all her cattle from beside abundant waters. No longer will be stirred by the foot of man and muddied by the hoofs of cattle. When I let her waters settle and make her streams flow like oil, declares the sovereign Lord. When I make Egypt desolate and strip the land of everything in it, when I strike down all who live there, then they will know that I am the Lord. This is the lament they will chant for her. The daughters of the nations will chant it. For Egypt and all their hordes will chant it, declares the sovereign Lord. And in the 12th year, the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, wail for the hordes of Egypt, and consign the earth below, both her and her daughters of the mighty nations, to those who go down to the pit. Say to them, are you more favored than others? Go down and be laid among the circumcised. They will fall among the killed by the sword. The sword is drawn. Let her be dragged off with all her hordes. From within the grave, the mighty leaders will say, Egypt and her allies, they have come down to lie with the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. Assyria is there, with all her whole army. She's surrounded by the graves of all her slain, all who've fallen by the sword. Their graves are in the depths of the pit, and her armies lie around her grave. All who had spread terror in the land of the living are slain, fallen by the sword. Elam is there, with all her hordes around her grave, all of them slain, fallen by the sword. All who spread terror in the land of the living went down like the uncircumcised to the earth below. They bear their shame with those who go down to the pit. A bed is made for her among the slain, with all the hordes around her. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword. Because of their terror had spread the land of the living, they bear the shame with those who go down to the pit. They are laid among the slain. And see, what he's listing all these nations. What do they have in common? They spread what? Terror to other nations. They tried to set themselves up, attack other nations, and terrorize other nations. And so God smote them. This is what happens to every country that terrorizes other people with war. God puts them in the grave. Meshach and Tubal are there with all their hordes around their graves. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword because they spread terror in the land of the living. Do they not lie with the other uncircumcised warriors who have fallen, who went down to the grave with their weapons of war, whose swords were placed under their heads? The punishment of their sins rested on their bones. Through the terror of these warriors had stalked through the land of the living. You too, O Pharaoh, will be broken and will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. Edom is there, her kings and all her princes, despite her power, are laid there and killed by the sword. They lie uncircumcised with those who go down to the pit. All the princes of the north and all the Sidonians are there. They went down slain in disgrace, despite the terror caused by their power. They lie uncircumcised with those killed by the sword and bear their shame with those who go down to the pit. Pharaoh, he and all his army will see them, and he will be consoled for all his hordes that are there killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. Although I had him spread terror in the land of the living, Pharaoh and all his hordes will be laid among the uncircumcised, those killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. All right, so the outline in your notes, you can see it better than probably on this screen, but Egypt is a dragon, not a lion. It's on March 4th, 585 BC it's given. And so, like a dragon troubling the waters, okay, so this dragon, this sea creature is coming up, consuming ships, consuming all these people, attacking people. This dragon is terrorizing the other nations, going out on the sea and attacking and terrorizing other people. And so it was going to be caught in God's net. Now see, after the Tyre and Sidon fall, there's a shift in military power. Now Egypt can dominate the seas because their competition on the seas is gone. So they go out to terrorize like a dragon going out, like, boats with dragons on it. They're going out and God says, I'm going to throw my net over you, dragon. I'm going to drag you up on shore. I'm going to destroy you. And predicts her destruction, the spoiling with swords. And then a lamentation for Egypt, her descent to Sheol with others, and a reunion with other nations. You're going to go down like all the other nations that were tyrannical and that spread terror. If you go around terrorizing people of the earth, you have a fate. Hell's waiting. All the nations that do that go to hell. I can't remember which founding father said it, but he said, there are no nations in the afterlife, so God has to punish them here in this one. And he does. And whereas if you're a Christian doing what's right, you might not receive individual punishment, but if you're part of a nation that's doing evil, your nation can be punished while you're in it. And if a nation won't repent, there's a reckoning. And the nations of the world right now are setting themselves up against God and denying God and acting like he doesn't exist and doing great evil. And if you think God is going to at some point go, well, that's enough of that, and act, you just don't understand history. He'll intervene. And he'll send them through what we call a dark ages. He'll send you back to the Stone Age. I mean, there was times of great civilization and he just destroyed Rome. All our aqueducts, all our science, all our buildings, all our roads. He just removed it and sent Europe back hundreds of years, technology-wise. And it was a long time before they came out of it. Hundreds of years. Well, really, until, 1,000 years. Basically, from 500 AD to the Reformation. And when you set yourself up as the big tree. God will cut you down. And so that's what he's predicting here. This prophecy was given 1 year and 7 months after Jerusalem fell. In the meantime, Gedaliah had been murdered, and the Jews went to Egypt. If you can see that in Jeremiah 41 and 43. And Jeremiah had foretold the ruin of those who went down. Chapter 44. Jeremiah said, let's not go to Egypt. That's no safe place. Oh, Egypt's secure. Egypt's our safety. The Babylonians can't get us there. And they died at the hand of the Babylonians there. Because Babylon went there. They thought they'd be safe in Egypt, and they were wrong. Like a sea dragon, Ezekiel is caught in God. Ezekiel says they're caught in God's net, and the net is Babylon, and cast out of the water for the birds and the beasts of prey. The earth is saturated with the blood. Heaven loses its brightness and becomes dark and taken out of its element, and he shall die. The earth will mourn and tremble. And we'll talk in a minute about what that means. The sun turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, and the stars. We're going to talk about what that means here in a little bit. The Pharaoh muddied the water. God will cause the waters to run as slow as oil. And he pictures a barren rather than cattle beside living waters. So he's like, you've got all these cows that you're raising there. You've got all these aqueducts. And you take the waters of the Nile and you've diverted it and you've made it into farming, into this paradise in the desert. And I'm going to wipe you out. And there's not going to be any cows walking around in pastures anymore. There's not going to be any more people because Pharaoh's going to kill them all and take them all away. And basically, Egypt's going to sit barren for 40 years. And that's the prediction. Verse 16 through 32. A funeral dirge, Ezekiel's chants, shows Egypt being dragged to the pit with other great nations, i.e. the abode of the dead. Neither her pride nor power nor her beauty can deliver her. Assyria, Elam, Edom's armies of the north, Syria, Sidon, they too died by the sword and was buried as warriors with their implements of war. When you are a nation that preys on the wealth of other nations and terrorizes them, God is coming for you. And that's exactly what the Soviet Union did, and God came for them. And as China tries to do that with Taiwan and other nations and exert their influence over they threatened Australia this week, that's not going to go well for them. God will destroy people who set themselves up like that. And he has the power to do it. It's not a graveyard of nations. These are the dead waiting as corpses for burial. Egypt is to join them. Egypt today is in desolation. Her armies are to lay dead, and with the rest of the uncircumcised. So, this is the situation where they're like chucking up the dead nations like cordwood. Tubal and Meshach are not among the dead, but are buried around the graves. Why? It's not told. God's terror came upon these nations, and Egypt will not escape. They terrorized the land of the living, so God terrorizes them by sending them to the land of the dead. Those who do not learn from the first plagues will have bloody water and darkness again. What were the plagues? What did he do with the Nile? He turned it to what? What did he do with the sun? And so he's making a play on that. You didn't learn when you rebelled against God the first time, and you're still doing it, and so now he's going to wipe you out. And that's what God does. Egypt, Assyria, Elam, Edom, and the other nations are to be joined in Sheol. Later they shall perish at the final judgment. Many would like to be a lion, but the king of beasts, but they're simply just dragons that are going to be caught and done away with. Note the day of the Lord is always described with phenomena like the sun darkened, moon blood, refusing to shine. It wasn't literal. Okay? So when Egypt fell to Babylon, did the sun turn to darkness? No. Did the moon go to darkness or turn to blood? No. Did the stars fall from the heaven? Literally. No. That is a term referring to a change in leadership. Okay? Now, there's a principle of hermeneutics that some people call the law of first mention. But when something is first mentioned in the Bible, it often this isn't in the notes. This is free from Kendall right here. When we see the concept of the sun, moon, and stars mentioned, not literally, for the first time in the Bible, it's in the story of Joseph, relating to Egypt, by the way. And Joseph saw a vision where the sun, moon, and stars bowed down to him. Who did that represent? My Genesis scholars. It represented who? It didn't represent the Israelites. The family. Okay, so who was the son? Jacob. Who was the moon? His mom. Who was the stars? His brothers. Okay? And they bow down to him. Now, did that happen? Yes. But was it literal? Was it literal something? No. What did the sun, moon, and stars represent? The authorities in Joseph's life. And so when you read about the sun, moon, and the stars falling or being destroyed or turning to blood, it's talking about the authorities. When the sun goes dark, that means the king's dead. When the moon turns to blood, that means the leadership, the rest of the leadership is killed. When the stars fall, the army fell. It's that kind of concept. Now, you don't believe me? Well, let's go back to our notes. It wasn't literal about Babylon. Isaiah 13:10. The stars of the heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Now, that's in a prophecy in chapter 13 of Isaiah, and who's it about? It's about Babylon. Now, did that happen literally? No. It was talking about how the king of Babylon, all those authorities were going to fall, and the Medo-Persians were going to take over. So it was just saying, it was an apocalyptic, symbolic way of saying the leaders are going to be changed. Okay? Or what about Tyre and Sidon in Joel 3:15? This is a prophecy against Tyre and Sidon. The sun and the moon will be darkened and the stars will no longer shine. Did that literally happen? No. But did the leaders and the people of Tyre and Sidon die and fall? Was there a change of authority? Yes. That's what it's talking about. And so when we read in the New Testament, like in Revelation, where it says the sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, and the stars will fall from the sky, is that literal? No. So when you got people like Hagee, who couldn't interpret a prophecy right if his life depended on it. If you get this Hagee guy out in Texas, oh, last year there's 5 blood moons in 1 year, and oh, it's a sign, it's revelation. Oh. We may be near the end of the world. That could be true, but it's not because of that. And that has nothing to do with it. You know, this Thursday night, here in the Eastern time zone, it'll be between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. There will be a lunar eclipse, one of the longest lunar eclipses in hundreds and hundreds of years. It's going to be a big one. It's going to be visible in a wide swath of the world. And there's going to be crackheads running around. Oh, this is some sort of sign that China's going to attack Taiwan. Well, I'm pretty sure China's going to attack Taiwan no matter what the moon does at this point. And, these have nothing to do with physical fulfillments. Okay? When Joel writes about that for the New Testament, he gives it in a prophecy. And then, Acts chapter 2, Peter quotes the prophecy and says, today it's fulfilled. Now, did the sun turn to darkness and the moon to blood and stars fall from the heaven on Acts chapter 2? No. What's it meaning? Authorities were being overturned. The power of Satan, the power of evil over the world was being overturned because the apostles were declaring to the people a new authority that in the name of Jesus Christ, you can receive the forgiveness of sins and the gift of the Holy Spirit if you'll repent and be baptized. He was overturning authorities. That's what it meant, that the sun would go dark and the moon and the stars would go dark. He's saying that the old authorities were being snuffed out. That's what it means in Ezekiel chapter 32. It's what it means in Isaiah 13. It's what it means in Joel 13. It's what it means in Acts chapter 2. It's what it means in Revelation. It's not literal. Okay? So don't look for some physical sign in the sky to be the fulfillment of the sun turned to darkness, the moon to blood. And when you hear these premillennialists spouting this stuff, you can just, your little spiritual radar can go off and go, ding, ding, ding. False teacher. We have a false teacher who does not understand how every other prophecy about that was fulfilled. If every other time it wasn't literal, why are we expecting Revelation to be literal? Including a fulfillment in the New Testament already. So, no. It's not literal. Don't expect anything to do with the sun turning dark and the moon to blood. I'm sure that NASA would tell you the moon can't turn to blood. Pretty sure. So it's not literal. Okay? Egypt has been a bright star. She would not shine in the day of the Lord. Not even the sun and the moon would shine. She could not be seen. Pharaoh calls himself the sun. He's the son of Amun-Ra, the sun god. And he's saying, you're no sun god, you're being snuffed out. By the way, that's like a universal thing that the devil liked to do for whatever reason, is he got everybody to believe in a sun god all around the world, and then that the kings are the descendants of sun gods. I just watched a documentary on the Mayans, and the Mayans believe that in this sun god, and their sun god, he's a little round face, looks like a sun, and he's got spiral eyes, and he always has his tongue out. I don't know why he has his tongue out, but I'm sure there's some weird significance to that. But that's sun god. But they would find that, and they found that carving in a tomb, and they're like, oh, it's a king. Because the Mayan kings taught that they were the sons on earth of the sun god. That's the same thing Pharaoh taught. That's the same thing all these wicked nations taught. Because it all comes from the same pagan religion that Nimrod established in Babylon before the confusing of the languages. And then when God confuses the languages, now they all have different languages, and they all spread out around the earth and build their pyramids all over the world. But it's all the same religion, just with new names. Because now they speak different languages. That's why they call the goddess, the fertility goddess, the goddess of 1,000 names. Because everybody had a fertility goddess. Everybody had a sun god. Everybody had a snake god and a water god. Yeah, they all had the same stuff. They even built their ziggurats, their towers of Babel. They all looked the same. They did it all over the world. I mean, you want proof that the Tower of Babel story is real? Just go compare the Mayan temples and Mayan stuff and the Aztec and the Incan with Egypt and Babylon and, Cambodia. It's the same lie all over everywhere. And go find a culture where they didn't build their buildings aligned to the solstices. Because they were all worshiping the sun. All over the world. So Egypt wouldn't shine anymore. Notice the absence of Israel and Judah in the so-called graveyard of nations. Why? Because God was going to bring them back. And we're going to get to that valley of dry bones. We're coming to that. Professional women mourners had to be used for the inhabitants of Egypt would not be there to mourn. They had to hire mourners because all the people are dead. There's no clear teaching to be derived about death for this text. So it says that these nations go down to the grave silent. And so people who believe in soul sleeping, like Jehovah's Witness friends, they believe that you're like your dog Rover. When you die all over. You don't have a soul and you just cease to exist. And you say, well, then how can they believe in a resurrection someday and that at least 120,000 are going to go to heaven and others are going to be living on a new earth, and the weird doctrines of the Jehovah's Witnesses? How do they believe what happens is that you soul sleep. That when you're dead, you're not conscious. Your soul isn't conscious. Well, that's in direct contradiction to plain teaching of Jesus, who taught that the rich man and Lazarus were very much conscious after death. But even beyond that, they try to take this verse as their proof here where it says that they go down to the grave silent. Well, first of all, it's not talking about an individual here. It's talking about a nation. And second of all, it's talking about their body, not their soul.
And it's not talking about spiritual hell, it's talking about the grave. That's why it doesn't translate Sheol, the word Sheol, as hell in this passage. It translates it as grave because nations don't have a soul, literally. Metaphorically they do, but they don't have one literally. So it's saying this nation's going to go down to the grave and be silent. It's talking about the body of the nation. And so this has anything to do with that. Job, look at it, it says, my days are fused and cease, and let me alone, that I may take comfort for a little while. Well, your days cease. It doesn't mean that your soul ceases when you die. That's one of their proof texts. Here's another one, Psalm 115, 17. The dead praise not the Lord, neither any that go down in silence. That, again, is talking about their body. I don't care whether you're Christian or non-Christian. When your body's dead and laying there, you're not praising Jesus. And then Isaiah 14:10. All they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? Thou become like us. And so they try to take these passages and say that you can't talk. Ezekiel shows that that's not the case. It's talking about nations. So right now, we are going to take a break for 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 40 after.